At 900, night erased borders, softened ambition, and briefly convinced cities to behave like neighbors, proving that darkness was history's most successful equalizer, patient, familiar, and unimpressed by scale. Many listen quietly here, night after night. If this calm travels with you, you may stay. Subscribing keeps this silence alive. By the time the sky fully darkened, the great cities of the world were no longer performing. Daylight had demanded effort. It required voices, posture, direction, and intention. Night required none of that. In Rome, streets that once led processions now led people home. In Baghdad, schedules loosened their grip and precision relaxed into routine. In Alexandria, the harbor reflected stars instead of commerce. None of these changes were dramatic. That was the point. Night did not announce itself, it simply took over. From a distance, these cities were famous for different reasons, and their reputations mattered deeply while the sun was present. Rome was remembered for authority, even when authority no longer quite arrived on time. Baghdad was admired for organization, knowledge, and its ability to function without noise. Alexandria lived between movement and stillness, always aware of water, always negotiating with trade. Yet once the lamps thinned and the air cooled, those identities became optional. Night allowed the cities to exist without explanation. This was the hour when borders quietly failed. Not political borders, which were already unreliable, but the softer ones people carried every day. The line between central streets and outer neighborhoods blurred as both grew equally dark. The difference between a grand residence and a modest room shrank. Once both were reduced to a single lamp and a shared silence. Even the separation between cities themselves felt less convincing. Somewhere, someone was closing a door in Rome. Somewhere else, someone did the same in Baghdad. In Alexandria, a window was shut against the breeze. These actions did not coordinate, yet they aligned perfectly. Sleep at this moment became a global habit rather than a personal decision. People did not go to bed because a clock commanded it, but because the city itself slowed to a speed that made wakefulness feel unnecessary. The night created a shared hour when bodies across continents responded the same way. Shoulders lowered, breathing deepened. Conversations ended without ceremony. There was no official signal. The world simply agreed, quietly, to rest. Silence at 900 was not empty, it was structured. It carried the sound of distant water, of sandals retreating, of wood settling into cooler air. In Rome, stone released heat. It had stored all day as if exhaling. In Baghdad, courtyards gathered night air and redistributed it gently, reminding houses that they were built to cooperate with darkness, not resist it. In Alexandria, the harbor did what it always did best at night, listened. This silence belonged to everyone because it excluded no one. Power did not disappear, but it lowered its voice. Guards remained at their posts, yet they shifted weight instead of issuing commands. Bakers prepared quietly for morning. Animals settled. Even authority seemed willing to wait. Night did not overthrow control. It made control unnecessary for a few hours, which was often enough. Large cities and small ones behaved the same way under darkness. The capital forgot it was a capital. The port forgot it connected continents. The former empire forgot it had once ruled anything beyond its walls. Night treated ambition as a daytime hobby and survival as a nighttime skill. It asked cities to do less, and in doing less, to endure. There was mild irony in this arrangement. The very cities that spent daylight asserting difference spent night proving similarity. All required water nearby. All relied on walls that held heat. All depended on predictable routines. All eventually went quiet. History prefers to measure cities by what they built, conquered, or declared. Night measured them by what they stopped doing. As sleep spread, the world did not become peaceful in a grand sense. Problems remained scheduled for morning. Disagreements waited patiently. Markets would reopen, orders would be given again. But for these hours, the cities participated in a rare experiment, existing without insisting on importance. The night did not belong to Rome, Baghdad, or Alexandria individually. It belonged to the habit they shared, the agreement to lower the voice of the world. This is why the night of 900 feels familiar even now. Not because the cities were the same as ours, but because their silence followed the same logic. When light withdraws, scale becomes irrelevant. Distance softens. And sleep, practical and unremarkable, quietly connects places that daylight works very hard to keep apart. By the time the night settled fully, distance stopped behaving the way it had been trained to during the day. Streets that had spent hours separating people by purpose, status, and direction now led nowhere in particular. They existed only to be crossed slowly, then abandoned. In this darkness, space did not disappear, but it lost its urgency. No one needed to get anywhere impressive. No one needed to be seen arriving. In Rome, the long memory of centrality softened. The city had once been designed to pull everything inward, roads bending toward authority, buildings insisting on hierarchy. At night, that architecture grew quiet and oddly cooperative. Distance between forum and alley mattered less when both were equally dark. The stones did not glow with meaning anymore. They simply cooled. A person walking home did not feel far from power or close to it. They felt the same number of steps away from sleep as everyone else. In Baghdad, distance was normally managed with care. The city excelled at connection during daylight, channels of movement, planned neighborhoods, systems that knew where they were going. Night did not dismantle that intelligence. It repurposed it. Paths became quieter, not busier. Intersections waited without expectation. Distance remained, but it stopped asking to be optimized. You could take the long way without consequence because nothing was being measured. Along the edges of Alexandria, distance took on a different character. Water always complicates the idea of separation. At night, the harbor erased the boundary between near and far by reflecting both equally. Ships anchored at different distances looked identical in the dark, reduced to silhouettes breathing gently against the tide. A light onshore did not announce how wealthy or important it was. It only announced that someone was still awake, which was already becoming rare. This was the quiet failure of borders. Not borders drawn by rulers, which were already unreliable, but borders created by routine. During the day, people lived in clearly defined zones. Work over here, home over there, market somewhere in between. At night, these distinctions loosened. The baker's route overlapped with the guard's. The scholar's walk resembled the porter's. Distance stopped sorting people into categories and began treating movement as a temporary inconvenience between one rest and the next. Night achieved this not through force, but through indifference. It did not argue that borders were unnecessary. It simply behaved as though they were irrelevant. A narrow street and a broad avenue both darkened at the same rate. A wealthy quarter and a modest one shared the same stars. When visibility shrank, scale followed. There was something faintly humorous about this arrangement. Cities spent enormous effort during daylight teaching people where they belonged. Night ignored those lessons entirely. It did not flatten society in a revolutionary sense, it merely postponed it. For a few hours, ambition was asked to wait its turn, and surprisingly it complied. Distance without borders also meant that faraway places felt closer than usual, not geographically, but emotionally. Somewhere else, another city was doing exactly this. Doors closing, lamps dimming, footsteps thinning. The knowledge that this was happening elsewhere did not require proof. It was assumed. Night encouraged this assumption because it repeated itself so reliably. Every evening, across regions that never coordinated, the same sequence unfolded. This repetition created a strange sense of global simultaneity. People who would never meet were entering similar rooms, touching similar objects, lowering themselves onto similar surfaces. Sleep, unlike trade or diplomacy, required no shared language. The body knew when to slow down. The city supported that knowledge by becoming less demanding. Distance also shrank inside the household. Rooms that felt separate during the day merged into a single zone of quiet. Activity retreated inward. The farthest corner of the house became irrelevant once everyone gathered near warmth, air, or habit. Even large houses behaved like small ones at night. They concentrated. Outside, the streets learned patience. They did not expect traffic. They did not promise discovery. They waited, fully prepared to remain unused. This waiting was not emptiness, it was restraint. The street at night was a held breath, not an abandoned space. It is worth noting that this lack of borders did not produce chaos. Quite the opposite. When distance stops demanding attention, behavior becomes predictable. People move carefully, voices lower naturally. Encounters become rare enough to be polite by default. Night reduced friction by reducing opportunity. In Rome, this meant that remnants of grandeur finally rested. Columns stopped witnessing. Statues watched nothing. Distance between monuments lost symbolic weight when no one was there to admire or fear them. In Baghdad, administrative precision paused gracefully, confident it would resume without damage. In Alexandria, the city leaned toward the water and let distance drift, rather than define. The irony, of course, is that daylight depended on these borders to function. Trade required routes, authority required centers, work required separation. Night did not threaten any of that. It merely reminded the city that it could survive several hours without enforcing distinctions. And that reminder, repeated nightly, mattered more than any declaration. As the hours deepened, distance became almost theoretical. The far end of the city felt no farther than the next room. The edge felt no more remote than the center. What mattered was not where you were, but that you were done moving. The city did not shrink. It relaxed. This relaxation allowed people to feel temporarily unplaced and therefore safe. You were not representing your district, your profession, or your status. You were simply someone within walls, under darkness, waiting for morning. Distance without borders created a brief anonymity that cities rarely allowed themselves. By the time sleep took hold fully, distance had completed its transformation. It still existed on maps and in memory, but it no longer organized experience. the city became a single, quiet field of rest, broken only by necessity. And in that field, Rome, Baghdad, and Alexandria behaved not as rivals, not as exemplars, but as participants in the same ancient agreement. Night did not connect these cities by road or sea. It connected them by absence. Absence of urgency, absence of display, absence of borders worth defending. And for a few hours, that absence was enough to make the world feel smaller, calmer, and oddly cooperative. There was a moment, sometime after the last errands were abandoned and before the deepest part of night settled in, when sleep stopped being a personal choice and became a shared condition. It was not announced. No bell marked it. No authority scheduled it. Yet across cities separated by sea, desert, and memory, bodies responded at roughly the same hour, as if trained by something older than instruction. This hour belonged neither to the early sleepers nor to the stubbornly awake. It belonged to the majority, those who drifted when the city stopped asking anything of them. In Rome, this happened when the streets grew too quiet to justify staying upright. In Baghdad, it arrived when schedules loosened enough to allow rest, without guilt. In Alexandria, it followed the subtle change in the harbor when water sounds replaced human ones. Sleep at this hour was not dramatic. It did not arrive as collapse or surrender. It arrived as agreement. The body recognized that nothing essential was being missed. The city confirmed this by withholding signals. No calls echoed, no lights demanded attention. The shared hour formed quietly, as if everyone had decided, independently and simultaneously, to stop insisting on presence. What made this hour remarkable was its consistency. Across regions that rarely synchronized anything else, this pause repeated night after night. People did not know they were participating in a global rhythm, but they were. The rhythm required no communication. It relied on fatigue, darkness, and the simple fact that most work could wait until morning without immediate disaster. During this hour, sleep spread unevenly but predictably. Some fell into it quickly, others hovered at the edge, listening to the last sounds of the city fading. The important detail was not how deeply people slept, but that they stopped contributing to noise. One by one, voices withdrew. Lamps dimmed or went out. Doors ceased opening. The city, sensing this withdrawal, lowered itself accordingly. This was the hour when hierarchy weakened without protest. Wealth did not purchase additional wakefulness. Status did not require longer visibility. Even those with power eventually faced the same limitations of flesh. The shared hour of sleep was mildly democratic, not by ideology but by biology. No one was impressive while unconscious, and the city accepted that truth without commentary. In Rome, centuries of ritual could not override this hour. The city that had once insisted on constant display eventually learned to sleep like anywhere else. Stone buildings held warmth, offering comfort rather than authority. Inner rooms became the center of life, not public spaces. The past did not vanish, but it went quiet, which was often enough. In Baghdad, a city known for order, the shared hour demonstrated that even the best organized systems required interruption. Night did not threaten efficiency. It preserved it. Sleep ensured that schedules would function again. The shared hour was maintenance disguised as rest. Bodies were being repaired so that the city could resume its intelligence without strain. Alexandria experienced this hour differently, but no less completely. The sea did not sleep, but the city did. The constant movement of water highlighted the stillness of people. Homes closed inward, leaving the shoreline to moonlight and tide. The shared hour felt wider there, as if the city had leaned back and allowed the night to carry more weight. There was a quiet humor in how predictably this hour unfolded. Cities that argued endlessly about precedence and importance surrendered nightly to the same solution. Sleep required no justification. It was practical, unglamorous, and effective. For all their differences, cities agreed on one thing without negotiation. Eventually, everyone lay down. This hour also softened time itself. Minutes lost their sharp edges. Hours stretched without consequence. For those not yet asleep, wakefulness became gentle rather than urgent. Thinking slowed, planning dissolved. Concerns were postponed not because they were resolved, but because they lacked the energy to persist. The city supported this by refusing to provide stimulation. The shared hour reduced the world to essentials: breath, warmth, stillness. Even dreams followed similar patterns: familiar places, repeated tasks, movements without purpose. The mind, like the city, reorganized itself into maintenance mode. Nothing new needed to happen. Continuation was sufficient. It is important to note that not everyone slept during this hour. Some guarded, some worked quietly, some remained awake out of habit or necessity. But even these exceptions acknowledged the rule. Their movements were careful, their voices minimal. They behaved as though surrounded by sleep, which they were. The shared hour shaped even those who did not fully enter it. For travelers, this hour was unmistakable. Inns grew silent, roads emptied, navigation shifted from ambition to caution. Moving during the shared hour felt intrusive, as if interrupting a conversation already underway. Most chose to stop, recognizing that arrival could wait. The shared hour also blurred the boundary between public and private. Streets felt personal when empty. Homes felt expansive when undisturbed. The city, usually divided into functions, became a single environment dedicated to rest. This was not planned. It emerged naturally from repetition. Over time, this hour trained cities. Architecture adapted to it. Thick walls, inner courtyards, narrow streets, all supported sleep by controlling sound and temperature. The shared hour shaped construction as much as daylight shaped markets. Night was not an absence to be endured. It was a condition to be accommodated. There is a temptation to romanticize this moment, to imagine perfect calm. That would be inaccurate. Night carried anxiety, discomfort, and interruption. Sleep was not always deep or peaceful, but the shared hour did not promise comfort. It promised pause, a reduction in demand, a chance to continue without collapsing. History rarely records this hour because nothing happened that could be summarized. No declarations, no turning points. Yet this hour occurred more reliably than any event history prefers to remember. Empires shifted, borders moved, names changed. The shared hour remained. In Rome, Baghdad, and Alexandria, people who disagreed on almost everything else participated equally in this nightly withdrawal. They did not call it unity. They did not celebrate it. They simply lay down. And in doing so, they kept their cities functioning without noise. The shared hour of sleep did not make cities gentle. It made them possible. Without it, streets would have worn down, bodies would have failed, and order would have required force. Sleep solved these problems quietly, night after night, without asking for recognition. As the hour deepened, consciousness loosened its grip. The city settled into a rhythm that required no oversight. Lamps burned low or went out entirely. The few remaining sounds blended into background. The shared hour reached its fullest expression when nothing new entered the system. This was the hour when the world felt briefly manageable, not because it was controlled, but because it was paused. People did not need to improve their cities at this moment. They needed only to remain within them, breathing, resting, waiting. When morning eventually approached, it did not erase this hour. It built upon it. Daylight depended on what night had preserved. Energy returned because it had been stored. Order resumed because it had been suspended gently rather than broken. The shared hour of sleep was not a luxury. It was infrastructure, invisible, uncelebrated, and absolutely necessary. Cities could argue about everything else, but on this, they agreed without words. And so, across Rome, Baghdad, Alexandria, and countless other places that history names less often, the same hour arrived. People turned inward, the city exhaled, and for a while the world belonged not to ambition or memory, but to rest. Silence did not happen by accident. It was not simply the absence of sound, nor the natural result of people lying down. In the cities of the year 900, silence functioned as a shared understanding, something quietly maintained rather than passively received. It was an agreement no one signed and no authority announced, yet everyone participated in it with surprising consistency. During the day, cities were loud because they had to be. Noise signaled activity, safety, coordination, and relevance. Voices confirmed presence. Tools confirmed purpose. Movement confirmed order. At night, these signals lost their usefulness. Silence replaced them not as a void, but as a different kind of information. Silence meant nothing urgent was happening, and that was valuable knowledge. In Rome, silence carried historical weight. The city had once equated sound with power. Crowds, announcements, rituals, and disputes filled public space. By 900, much of that volume had already diminished, but night completed the process. Silence settled over ruins and neighborhoods alike, treating both with equal indifference. It did not distinguish between what had mattered and what still did. It simply lowered everything. This lowering was deliberate in practice, even if it felt natural. People learned quickly that noise at night attracted attention without benefit. A raised voice did not summon help. It summoned inconvenience. Silence became a form of courtesy extended to neighbors, guards, animals, and oneself. To remain quiet was not obedience. It was efficiency. In Baghdad, silence was almost architectural. The city had been designed to function smoothly, and that included knowing when not to operate at full volume. Courtyards absorbed sound. Walls moderated echoes. Streets narrowed where necessary. These were not aesthetic choices. They were agreements built into stone. Nighttime silence was supported physically, making it easier to maintain socially. This silence did not eliminate communication. It changed its form. A soft knock replaced a call. A gesture replaced a shout. Proximity mattered more than projection. People learned to exist within smaller acoustic boundaries. Conversations happened inward rather than outward. Words were used carefully as though they cost something, which at night they did. In Alexandria, silence negotiated constantly with water. The sea never stopped making sound, but its rhythm was predictable and non-demanding. Human noise, by contrast, felt abrupt and unnecessary at night. The city learned to let the harbor speak while people withdrew. Silence here did not mean stillness. It meant choosing which sounds were allowed to remain. What made this silence remarkable was its universality. It did not require shared culture, religion, or language. It required only mutual awareness. Each person understood that their noise would break something fragile and that preserving it benefited everyone. Silence became a commons, like air or shade, shared and protected informally. There was a mild irony in how this worked. Cities that struggled to enforce complex rules during the day achieved near universal compliance at night without effort. No patrol was required to insist on quiet. No penalties were posted. The agreement held because breaking it offered no reward. Silence was self-reinforcing. This agreement extended beyond homes. Streets participated. Animals adjusted. Even tools seemed to know when to stop. The city as a whole behaved as though it were holding something delicate. That something was not peace in a moral sense. It was continuity. Silence allowed the night to pass without incident, which was the goal. Silence also leveled experience. Loudness is a form of dominance. It claims space and attention. Silence removed that advantage. Those who relied on presence rather than volume adapted easily. Those accustomed to command found themselves reduced to whispers. Night did not argue against authority. It simply refused to amplify it. In Rome, this meant that remnants of imperial posture finally rested. Titles did not echo. Rank did not announce itself. Silence rendered the city temporarily unhierarchical, not by design but by consequence. Everyone navigated the same darkness. Everyone benefited from restraint. In Baghdad, silence functioned as trust. Trust that systems would resume. Trust that nothing critical required immediate intervention. Trust that people would act responsibly without instruction. This trust was rewarded nightly. The city woke intact. In Alexandria, silence was spatial. It widened interiors and narrowed exteriors. Homes became the primary acoustic units. Outside, the city receded into background. Silence made private life possible by withdrawing public pressure. The agreement of silence also shaped how time was perceived. Loud environments demand attention. Silent ones permit drift. At night, minutes became less defined. Hours blended. The absence of noise removed markers that usually structure awareness. People slipped into rest without noticing the exact moment it happened. Those who remained awake respected this agreement most visibly. Guards paced softly. Workers moved deliberately. Travelers adjusted routes to avoid disturbance. Silence was not enforced on them. They enforced it on themselves because it made their tasks easier. A quiet city was predictable. Predictability reduced risk. There is often an assumption that silence equals fear. In these cities, silence equaled familiarity. People were accustomed to it. They knew its texture. They trusted it enough to sleep within it. Fear, when present, made noise. Silence suggested that nothing unexpected was occurring. This did not mean danger was absent. It meant danger was not active. Silence signaled stability rather than safety. A subtle but important distinction. The night did not promise protection. It promised that no one was currently breaking the agreement. The agreement could be broken, of course. A cry, a fall, an argument would puncture the quiet, but the response to such breaks revealed the strength of the silence itself. People reacted not with chaos, but with focus. Noise stood out precisely because it was rare. Silence made signals clearer when they mattered. Over time, this nightly agreement shaped memory. People remembered nights as calm, even when they were not entirely so. The dominant impression was quiet because quiet framed everything else. Loud moments became exceptions rather than the rule. Cities learned from this. They began to value silence not just as absence, but as infrastructure. Thick walls, courtyards, covered streets. All of these supported the agreement by making it easier to keep. Silence influenced design as much as commerce influenced markets. The humor in all of this lies in how effortlessly it worked. Humans who struggled to cooperate on almost any other matter cooperated nightly on silence. Not because they were virtuous, but because it suited them. Silence made rest possible. Rest made survival manageable. This agreement did not require belief. It required repetition. Night after night, the same behavior produced the same result. Quiet led to continuity. Continuity led to trust. Trust reinforced quiet. The cycle sustained itself without ideology. By the deepest part of night, silence reached its fullest expression. It was no longer something people actively maintained. It simply existed, dense and even. The city did not feel empty. It felt held. In Rome, Baghdad, and Alexandria, this silence was one of the few experiences shared equally across class and neighborhood. Everyone benefited from it. Everyone contributed to it. It belonged to no one, which is why it lasted. When morning eventually broke the agreement, it did so gently. Noise returned gradually. Silence released its hold without resistance. No one mourned its passing because it was expected to return. This is the quiet competence of historical cities. They did not survive by being loud enough to dominate the night. They survived by learning when to stop speaking altogether. During the day, cities insisted on being measured. They competed in size, in influence, in the number of people who needed to know their name. Capitals reminded provinces of their importance. Ports reminded inland towns of their usefulness. Large places spoke first. Smaller ones waited. This hierarchy felt natural in daylight, reinforced by traffic, announcements, and the steady performance of relevance. At night, this system lost interest in itself. Darkness did not care how many streets a city contained or how far its authority extended. It did not reward density or punish modest scale. A settlement of a few thousand people and a city of hundreds of thousands entered night through the same narrow door. Lamps went out, voices thinned, movement slowed. Rank, which required witnesses, found itself without an audience. In Rome, this forgetting was especially noticeable. The city had spent centuries asserting its size not just physically but symbolically. Even long after its dominance faded, it continued to behave as though being large meant being central. At night, however, Rome felt no larger than it needed to be. Neighborhoods became self-contained worlds. The distance between them mattered less than the shared experience of quiet. A massive city learned to behave like a collection of small ones, which was, in practice, what it had always been. In Baghdad, scale usually functioned as coordination. Size allowed complexity. Complexity allowed knowledge to circulate. But once the shared hour of sleep settled in, Baghdad's vastness softened. The systems that made it impressive during the day stepped back. What remained were rooms, courtyards, and streets that could have belonged to any well-organized town. The city did not shrink. It simplified. Along the edges of Alexandria, the distinction between a major port and a minor coastal town blurred at night. Ships anchored quietly regardless of how important their cargo had been. The shoreline did not advertise scale. Water treated every harbor the same once visibility faded. A small fishing village and a great trading city listened to identical waves. This forgetting of rank did not mean that differences disappeared entirely. Large cities still had more buildings. Smaller ones still had fewer lights. But the emotional weight of those differences faded. At night, no one benefited from reminding themselves how important their city was. Importance did not help sleep. Importance did not warm a room. Importance did not make darkness easier to navigate. What replaced rank was familiarity. People knew their immediate surroundings and trusted them. The city beyond that radius ceased to matter until morning. In a small town, this radius covered most of the settlement. In a large city, it covered a neighborhood. The experience felt the same. The world became manageable by becoming smaller, not by asserting dominance. There was a subtle comfort in this. Residents of smaller places no longer felt peripheral. Residents of larger places no longer felt responsible for being central. Everyone occupied a space that was sufficient. Night equalized by lowering expectations rather than raising standards. This effect was reinforced by the way sound behaved. In daylight, large cities announced themselves through noise. Markets, traffic, crowds all signaled scale. At night, silence reduced everything to similar acoustic proportions. A footstep echoed the same way, whether it occurred in a famous capital or an obscure town. Quiet made places comparable. Architecture participated in this forgetting. Large civic buildings went dark and inert. Their size mattered only in how long they held heat. Small houses did the same. The difference between monumental and modest blurred once both stopped functioning. A building without activity was simply shelter. Even memory adjusted. People did not go to bed thinking about the greatness of their city. They thought about whether the door was closed, whether the room was cool enough, whether morning would come soon. Night reorganized thought around survival and comfort, not reputation. There is a mild irony here. Cities spent enormous resources teaching people to respect hierarchy, yet nightly demonstrated that hierarchy was optional. This did not destabilize order, it preserved it. By allowing people to forget rank temporarily, cities prevented resentment from accumulating. Everyone received a few hours free from comparison. Small cities benefited especially from this. At night, they were no longer defined by what they lacked. They had enough streets to grow quiet, enough homes to go dark, enough people to withdraw. That was sufficient. They did not feel incomplete. They felt finished for the day. Large cities benefited differently. Night relieved them of the burden of constant significance. They did not need to justify their size or complexity. They could rest without explanation. For a few hours, being large offered no advantage and imposed no obligation. This forgetting also applied to political rank. Capitals did not behave like capitals after midnight. Administrative centers did not administer. Power structures paused. Authority did not vanish, but it stopped presenting itself. The city did not need reminders of who was in charge to remain intact. Travelers noticed this immediately. Arriving in a major city at night felt anticlimactic. There were fewer signs, fewer signals, fewer gestures announcing arrival. A small town offered the same experience. Darkness stripped away ceremony. Entry became simple. In this sense, night democratized arrival. You entered quietly or not at all. The city accepted you without performance. Size did not amplify welcome. Silence flattened it. The forgetting of rank also shaped behavior toward risk. Large cities often relied on their scale to absorb problems. Small ones relied on caution. At night, both behaved cautiously. Scale offered no protection in darkness. Care replaced confidence everywhere. This shared humility mattered. It trained cities to survive without constant assertion. By learning nightly how to be ordinary, cities protected themselves from the strain of always being exceptional. Over time, this rhythm influenced how people understood place. A city was not just its daytime function, it was also its nighttime restraint. A city that could not quiet itself was exhausting. A city that could forget its rank was livable. The humor in this lies in how predictable it was. Night after night, the same phenomenon occurred, yet no one advertised it. Guidebooks praised grandeur. Chronicles recorded importance. Silence received no credit. And yet silence did the work of equalization more effectively than any decree. As the night deepened, the forgetting became complete. Cities stopped competing even in imagination. They existed alongside one another without comparison. Somewhere else, another city was doing exactly this. Not better, not worse, just similarly. By the time sleep reached its deepest phase, the idea of rank felt distant and faintly unnecessary. Morning would restore it. Signs would reappear. Traffic would resume. Importance would be claimed again. But for these hours, the world operated without a scoreboard. This is not a story of utopia. Inequality did not vanish. Power did not dissolve. But the nightly suspension of rank made endurance possible. It reminded people that cities could function without constant measurement. In Rome, Baghdad, Alexandria, and countless unnamed places, the same lesson repeated quietly. Size mattered less than rhythm. Importance mattered less than habit. Survival favored those who could pause. And so, under darkness, cities large and small forgot who they were supposed to be. They became simply places where people slept. And that, night after night, was enough. Night did not govern cities by decree. It governed them by light, or more precisely, by the careful absence of too much light. In the year 900, the order that held after sunset did not depend on proclamations, patrols, or posted rules. It depended on lamps, placed where they mattered, dimmed when they did not, and respected by everyone who understood the cost of breaking the balance. During the day, cities relied on rules to move people along, signs pointed, voices instructed, authority corrected. At night, those mechanisms grew inefficient. Words traveled poorly in darkness. Commands echoed without witnesses. Law required visibility to function well, and night offered very little of it. Lamps solved this problem quietly. They guided behavior without argument. A lamp did not tell you what to do. It told you where you were. That was enough. Light revealed a threshold, a step, a corner. It marked a boundary without announcing it. People adjusted naturally, slowing where light narrowed, stopping where it ended. The city became legible again, not through instruction, but through illumination. In Rome, this system was especially visible precisely because so much of the city had once depended on public display. After sunset, the grand avenues did not demand attention. They faded. What remained were small pools of light at doorways and intersections. These lamps did not proclaim authority. They offered orientation. A person moved from one glow to the next, learning the city anew as a sequence of safe pauses rather than a map of power. The humor here was subtle. A city that had once written law in stone now relied on flame, not because law failed, but because it was unnecessary at this hour. No one needed to be told to avoid darkness entirely. They learned by experience. Darkness slowed movement. Light permitted it. The city educated through environment rather than enforcement. In Baghdad, lamps complemented planning rather than replacing it. The city already understood circulation. Night refined that understanding. Lamps appeared where people still needed to move, near wells, courtyards, and late working spaces. Elsewhere, darkness was allowed to settle fully. This selective illumination did not restrict freedom. It shaped it. People went where light invited them and stopped where it did not. Laws at night would have required constant repetition. Lamps required none. They were patient. They did not argue. They did not escalate. They simply existed, steady and reliable, until they were no longer needed. In this way, lamps became the city's most effective nighttime officials. Along the harbor of Alexandria, lamps performed an even more delicate task. They negotiated between land and water. A single light could signal safety without promising arrival. Ships recognized these signals immediately. They did not require instruction. Light on shore told them where the city ended and the sea began. Darkness beyond preserved distance. Law could not have communicated this so clearly. What mattered most was that lamps were limited. Excessive light would have undone their purpose. It would have invited movement where rest was needed. It would have prolonged activity unnecessarily. Cities learned this through repetition. A lamp too bright created noise. A lamp too numerous invited gathering. Night responded poorly to enthusiasm. Thus, restraint became policy without being named as such. Lamps were placed deliberately and left alone. Their maintenance was simple. Their message was consistent. This consistency trained behavior far more effectively than threat ever could. People internalized these signals quickly. Children learned where it was acceptable to move. Travelers learned which routes were reliable after dark. Workers learned when to stop. Lamps replaced rules by reducing the need for decision. You followed light because it made sense, not because it was required. This system also reduced conflict. Laws create disputes when they are interpreted differently. Lamps did not invite interpretation. They were either there or not. Their presence simplified choices. Fewer choices meant fewer mistakes. Fewer mistakes meant fewer interventions. Night, in this way, revealed something important about governance. Order did not always require authority to speak. Sometimes it required authority to design quietly and then step back. Lamps were governance without voice. There was also an economic logic to this. Maintaining law enforcement at night was expensive and exhausting. Maintaining lamps was cheaper and sustainable. oil, wick, flame. Simple materials produced predictable outcomes. The city conserved energy by letting light do the work. This did not mean that rules disappeared entirely. They receded. Night was not lawless, it was law-light. The expectations were understood rather than stated. You did not need to be told to avoid unlit streets. The absence of light already suggested caution. This suggestion was gentler than command. It preserved dignity. People chose restraint rather than submitting to it. The city appeared cooperative rather than controlling. That appearance mattered because it encouraged compliance without resentment. In Rome, this shift was especially instructive. A city long accustomed to authority learned that guidance could be quieter than command. Lamps did not replace memory of law. They complemented it by offering a nightly demonstration of how little instruction was actually needed. In Baghdad, the lesson was efficiency. Systems that functioned best during the day did not insist on operating unchanged at night. Lamps allowed the city to scale down without collapsing. Complexity rested. Simplicity took over. In Alexandria, the lesson was balance. Light had to acknowledge water, wind, and movement. Too much light distorted reflection. Too little invited error. The city learned where to place glow so that it clarified rather than confused. There is a gentle irony in how this worked across cultures. Cities that debated governance endlessly agreed silently on illumination. No council minutes recorded lamp placement debates. Yet the outcome shaped nightly behavior more effectively than many written codes. Lamps also respected privacy. They illuminated paths without exposing interiors. Law often intrudes. Light, when used carefully, does not. This distinction mattered in dense cities. People needed to move without being observed excessively. Lamps offered enough visibility to navigate, not enough to scrutinize. As the night deepened, lamps became markers of last activity. When a light went out, it signaled completion rather than abandonment. The city read these signals accurately. A darkened street was not neglected. It was finished for the night. This reading extended to time itself. Lamps marked phases of night. Early lamps for movement, later lamps for necessity. Finally, darkness for rest. The city transitioned smoothly, without announcement. Those who remained awake paid close attention to these cues. Guards positioned themselves where light already existed. Workers concluded tasks as illumination faded. Travelers paused rather than pushed forward. Lamps coordinated without coordinating. This coordination reduced the need for vigilance. A well-lit city at night required less watching because behavior aligned naturally. Darkness outside the light created boundaries without fences. Light inside created islands of certainty. Over generations, this system shaped urban instincts. People trusted light more than instruction. They learned to read it intuitively. Children grew up understanding where night allowed them to go. Adults accepted limits without complaint. The humor returns here, quiet and persistent. Cities capable of issuing complex laws relied at night on simple flames, not because they were primitive, but because they were practical. A lamp did not forget its purpose. A law often did. When morning approached, lamps did not resist daylight. They were extinguished without ceremony. Their work was done. Law returned to its place. But the memory of guidance without command lingered. This memory mattered. It reminded cities that order could be achieved softly, that governance could be embedded rather than imposed, that people responded well to clarity without coercion. Night, through lamps, taught cities how to behave with less effort. It showed that rules were not always the strongest tool. Sometimes all that was required was enough light to see where you were going and enough darkness to know when to stop. In the end, lamps did not replace laws. They revealed their limits. They demonstrated that at certain hours, behavior organized itself best when authority whispered through design rather than spoke through decree. And so, across Rome, Baghdad, Alexandria, and countless other places whose names mattered less at night, lamps guided steps while laws slept. The city remained intact, not because it was enforced, but because it was understood. There was a moment the street learned to listen. It happened after the final footstep faded, when movement had completed its daily argument and conceded, briefly, to stillness. The street did not empty all at once. It thinned. One person turned a corner, another closed a door. Then there was a pause, long enough for the ground to notice the absence of weight. During the day, streets were instruments. They carried goods, instructions, warnings, and ambition. At night, after the last footstep, they became something else. They stopped transporting intention and began holding memory. This change was not symbolic. It was practical. A street without people needed to behave differently in order to remain useful by morning. In Rome, this transformation was layered. Some streets had been walked for centuries, and they remembered pressure. After the last footstep, stone adjusted. Heat released slowly. Dust settled where it could finally remain undisturbed. The street did not celebrate emptiness. It accepted it as maintenance. An unused street was not failing. It was resting. This rest had rules, though none were written. The street did not invite sudden activity. It discouraged haste through darkness and uneven ground. Corners softened into shadow. The surface became legible only to those who already knew it. This was not exclusion. It was a test of familiarity. If you belonged there, you moved easily. If you did not, you slowed down, which was the desired outcome. In Baghdad, streets after the last footstep displayed restraint with intention. The city understood circulation deeply, and it understood when circulation should cease. Narrow passages amplified this understanding. Sound lingered longer there, so silence mattered more. After movement ended, the street did not echo. It absorbed. Walls and ground collaborated to keep quiet intact. The street at this hour did not vanish. It became attentive. It registered small disturbances with precision. A dropped object, a shifting animal. A single voice carried farther than it should, precisely because nothing competed with it. This sensitivity was not vulnerability, it was clarity. The street knew what belonged and what did not. In Alexandria, the street after the last footstep negotiated with moisture and wind. Near the harbor, salt air altered surfaces. The absence of traffic allowed smells to reorganize. Fish, rope, wood, and water formed a quiet catalog. The street held these without comment. It did not announce itself. It waited. Waiting was the street's primary task. It waited for morning, for light, for weight to return. But this waiting was active rather than idle. Materials adjusted temperature. Small debris shifted to edges. The street prepared itself to be walked again. This preparation required calm. The humor in all this was subtle, Streets that spent the day being trampled took pride in not being used. They behaved better when left alone. No one praised them for this. No chronicle recorded a successful night of inactivity. And yet, inactivity preserved them more effectively than constant use ever could. After the last footstep, the street also lost its role as a boundary between private and public. With no one present, it belonged to neither. It was simply a surface exposed to night. Houses withdrew behind doors and walls. The street remained visible but unclaimed. This neutrality reduced tension. There was nothing to defend. This neutrality also altered how time felt. Without footsteps, time loosened. The street no longer measured hours by traffic. It measured them by cooling, by the slow migration of shadow. Time became environmental rather than social. Those few who still moved during this period understood the change immediately. Their steps sounded louder than intended. They adjusted unconsciously, placing feet more carefully. The street taught them how to behave by reacting to them. It did not need signs. Sound itself was instruction. In Rome, this meant that ancient paving regained authority. It dictated pace through texture rather than decree. In Baghdad, it meant that routes, designed for flow, now enforced pause. In Alexandria, it meant that proximity to water reshaped sound and caution. Different cities, same lesson. The street after the last footstep was not a place of fear, despite later assumptions. It was a place of precision. Danger did not increase. It became more detectable. With fewer signals, anomalies stood out. The street functioned as an early warning system by being quiet enough to notice interruption. Animals understood this before humans ever articulated it. Cats crossed confidently, dogs chose familiar paths, birds adjusted perches. The street at night belonged to those who moved lightly and predictably. This was not hierarchy, it was adaptation. This period also created memory without narrative. People rarely remembered specific nights, yet they remembered the feeling of the street being empty. That feeling informed behavior the next day. They walked knowing the street needed rest. They avoided unnecessary damage. They respected surfaces because they depended on them. There is a temptation to imagine the street as lonely after the last footstep. That is a daytime projection. At night, loneliness was not the dominant condition. Completion was. The street had done its work. It did not require company to justify existence. This completion allowed the city to reset. Streets that never rested degraded quickly. Streets that rested nightly endured. The rhythm was simple: use, pause, recover, resume. Cities that learned this rhythm survived. The street's relationship with light changed after the last footstep as well. Lamps became markers rather than guides. They no longer directed movement. They signaled closure. A lit doorway indicated someone awake. A dark stretch indicated agreement. Light became punctuation rather than sentence. In Baghdad, the precision of this punctuation was notable. Lamps remained where necessary, not where impressive. Their placement acknowledged that the street no longer needed to be navigated extensively. It needed to be left intact. In Rome, light accentuated age. Stone looked different when not stepped on. Surfaces revealed history when not obscured by motion. The street remembered itself briefly before being asked to perform again. In Alexandria, reflections replaced activity. Light met water and returned altered. The street participated in this exchange without moving. It became a quiet observer of its own environment. The street after the last footstep also revealed how little movement was actually required. Most traffic was habit rather than necessity. Night stripped movement down to essentials. What remained was manageable. This lesson did not change daytime behavior entirely, but it softened it. Over time, cities internalized this lesson. They designed streets to survive inactivity as well as activity. Drainage, materials, and layout accounted for rest. The street was treated as something that needed downtime, like people did. This recognition was practical rather than sentimental. A rested street reduced repair. Reduced repair reduced cost. Reduced cost increased stability. Night contributed to urban survival in ways no decree could. The mild irony persisted. The street's most important work happened when no one was watching. It healed, it recalibrated, it prepared. History paid attention elsewhere. As dawn approached, the street did not resist. It accepted the return of footsteps as a phase rather than a disruption. The last footstep of night was answered by the first of morning. The street transitioned without complaint because it had rested. In this way, the street after the last footstep was not an ending. It was a hinge, a brief interval where the city trusted itself enough to stop moving. That trust was rewarded daily. Across Rome, Baghdad, Alexandria, and innumerable places with fewer names, the same sequence repeated. Movement ceased, the street listened, night held, and the city endured by doing nothing for a while. When the street finally released its attention, homes quietly accepted responsibility. This transfer happened without ceremony. Doors had already closed. Windows had already narrowed their view. What remained was an inward movement so familiar that it barely registered as a change. The city did not disappear at this hour. It folded. During the day, houses functioned as support structures. They stored tools, sheltered bodies briefly, and released people back into streets that demanded presence. At night, that relationship reversed. Streets withdrew. Homes became the primary environment, not as display but as containment. The house did not expand outward. It gathered inward, concentrating life into fewer rooms, fewer sounds, fewer decisions. In Rome, this inward turn was shaped by stone and memory. Many homes had been reworked repeatedly, their original purposes softened by time. Night revealed their true function. Inner rooms became central. Corridors lost importance. Public-facing spaces went dark first, as though politely excusing themselves. The house reorganized around warmth and habit rather than status. This reorganization was practical. Heat retained better when activity clustered. Light stretched further when walls enclosed it closely. Sound behaved more predictably. A home that turned inward required less energy to maintain and offered more stability in return. Night rewarded this efficiency immediately. In Baghdad, inward turning was deliberate by design. Courtyards moderated temperature. Thick walls insulated sound. Homes were built expecting night to matter. When darkness arrived, rooms closest to the courtyard became active while outer edges quieted. The house breathed inward, using its own structure to create calm. This calm was not luxurious, it was functional. Furniture was minimal. Objects remained where they were needed. Night did not invite rearrangement. It invited reduction. The fewer surfaces touched, the fewer sounds produced. The home simplified itself in response to darkness. In Alexandria, inward turning was negotiated with air and moisture. Sea breezes required careful management. Windows were adjusted rather than sealed. Shutters controlled flow without eliminating it. The house did not close completely. It filtered. This filtering created a sense of enclosure without suffocation. Homes at night did not try to impress. Decoration faded in importance once light lowered. What mattered was familiarity. People moved through rooms without looking closely. They knew where everything was. This knowledge reduced movement. Reduced noise. The house rewarded those who knew it well. The humor here was understated. Homes spent the day serving outward life and the night serving inward life, yet rarely received credit for either. They were expected to adjust seamlessly, and they did. Night after night, houses performed this shift without complaint. This inward turn also reshaped social interaction. Conversations narrowed, voices softened, attention focused on those physically present rather than absent obligations. The house encouraged this by limiting space. Distance inside the home shrank. People gathered closer, not necessarily emotionally, but physically. Proximity did the work. Children learned this instinctively. They understood which rooms were nighttime rooms and which were daytime ones. They adjusted behavior accordingly. Adults followed the same pattern, often without realizing it. Night trained households as effectively as it trained cities. Homes also turned inward in time. Activities shortened. Tasks deferred. Decisions postponed. The house communicated this by withdrawing resources. Less light meant fewer tasks possible. Cooler air meant stillness. The environment suggested rest without command. In Rome, this meant that even grand homes behaved modestly at night. Their scale offered no advantage. Large spaces were inefficient to heat and light. Families retreated to smaller rooms, leaving grandeur unused. Size became a liability rather than a privilege after sunset. In Baghdad, inward turning supported continuity. Homes protected internal rhythms regardless of outside conditions. Even during periods of uncertainty, night restored a sense of order within walls. The house became a stable unit within a larger system. In Alexandria, inward turning balanced exposure and protection. The house allowed the presence of the sea without surrendering to it. This balance shaped nightly routines. Windows were adjusted, lamps positioned carefully. The home calibrated itself. The inward turn also altered perception of the outside world. Once enclosed, distant events lost urgency. News could wait, problems could wait. The house filtered not just air and sound, but information. Only what was immediately relevant remained. This filtering was protective. It prevented overload. It allowed bodies to recover. It preserved attention for morning. Night made homes guardians of restraint. There is a tendency to imagine medieval homes as cramped or uncomfortable. Night challenges that assumption. Comfort was relative to expectation. A well-understood space that responded predictably to darkness was comfortable enough. Luxury was unnecessary. Reliability mattered more. Homes also preserved continuity through repetition. Nightly routines reinforced memory. Objects stayed in place, movements repeated. The house became an archive of habit. This archive was more durable than written record. The inward turn shaped sleep itself. Sleeping spaces were chosen for insulation, not aesthetics. Bedding remained simple. Sleep did not need to be impressive. It needed to be possible. Homes optimized for that outcome. Even those who did not sleep immediately benefited from the inward turn. Quiet allowed reflection without stimulation. The house became a container for thought that did not demand resolution. Ideas could drift without pressure. This drift was important. It allowed the mind to disengage gradually. The house supported this by offering few distractions. Night reduced choice deliberately. Over time, this inward orientation influenced how homes were built and repaired. Additions prioritized inner rooms. Openings were controlled. Materials chosen for thermal and acoustic properties. Architecture remembered night. The humor persists. Societies that celebrated public achievement relied privately on inward-facing spaces to survive. Homes did the quiet work of preservation while cities claimed credit elsewhere. As the night deepened, homes reached their most inward state. Most rooms fell silent. Activity concentrated further. The house felt smaller, but more complete. Nothing essential lay outside its walls. This completeness allowed trust. People trusted that the outside world could wait. They trusted the house to hold them. That trust was repaid with rest. When morning approached, homes did not resist opening outward again. They had stored energy. Doors would open, windows would widen, the city would reassemble. But for these hours, homes belonged entirely to the inside. They turned away from streets and toward bodies. They asked nothing except stillness, and in exchange, they made night livable. Across Rome, Baghdad, Alexandria, and countless unnamed places, this inward turn repeated reliably. Houses closed their outer faces and revealed their inner purpose. The city folded into itself, and life continued quietly within walls. At night, water did not sleep, but it learned to listen. When cities quieted themselves enough, the harbor stopped competing with human sound and began carrying it instead. This was not a metaphor. It was physics, patience, and habit. The surface accepted every remaining vibration and decided whether to return it or let it sink. During the day, harbors performed. They announced arrival and departure, counted value in hulls and ropes, measured importance by congestion. At night, performance ended. What remained was function without display. Water held ships in place. Tides adjusted. Ropes tightened and relaxed. The harbor did not need to explain itself. It only needed to continue. In Alexandria, this listening felt immediate. The city's edge was never fully separate from the sea, and night made that intimacy obvious. As voices withdrew from keys and lamps narrowed their reach, water inherited the soundscape. Small waves repeated themselves with disciplined indifference. Wood answered gently. Metal learned restraint. The harbor took attendance without roll call. This listening changed behavior. Those still awake moved differently near water. Steps slowed. Hands adjusted rope rather than yanking it. Tools were set down carefully. Sound carried farther across a flat surface than across streets, and everyone knew it. The harbor trained people through consequence rather than instruction. Loudness returned, amplified. Quiet passed unnoticed. The lesson taught itself. In Rome, where the relationship to open water was mediated by river and memory, the same principle applied. Night made water a messenger rather than a backdrop. Along the river, reflections replaced crowds. The absence of traffic allowed currents to define pace. Bridges stopped being thoroughfares and became silhouettes. Water did not announce what had been built over it. It reflected it and waited.
Listening water also reorganized distance. A sound made on shore traveled across the surface and returned altered, thinner, delayed. This delay mattered. It created a buffer between action and response. People learned that the harbor heard them even when the city did not. That awareness encouraged restraint. The harbor was not a judge. It was a witness. In Baghdad, the lesson was quieter but no less present. Canals and river edges at night absorbed the city's remaining motion. Water moderated heat and sound simultaneously. It accepted excess energy and redistributed it slowly. The city leaned on this capacity, allowing the night to function without strain. Harbor water listened because the city had learned to speak less. This relationship was reciprocal. When human sound diminished, water became audible. When water became audible, people adjusted further. The cycle reinforced itself. Night deepened not by decree, but by acoustics. There was humor here, understated and persistent. Cities that spent centuries arguing with water about control and access eventually relied on it for calm. Engineers could channel it, administrators could tax it. Only night allowed it to teach. And water taught one lesson repeatedly: move gently or be heard everywhere. Listening water also changed how safety was perceived. During the day, harbors felt risky because they were busy. At night, risk became legible. With fewer movements, anomalies stood out. A splash carried meaning. A rope creak mattered. Listening made vigilance efficient. Guards did not need to watch constantly. They needed to listen occasionally. This efficiency reduced tension. People trusted the harbor to announce disruption. The city accepted this trust because it was rewarded nightly. Most nights, nothing happened. The water listened anyway. The harbor at night also preserved memory differently. During the day, memory attached to events. At night, it attached to repetition. The same sound patterns returned. The same reflections formed. The same gentle motions occurred. Memory became environmental rather than narrative. People remembered the harbor not by story, but by feel. This feel shaped work. Sailors learned when to stop adjusting lines. Dock workers learned when to leave. Merchants learned that value slept at night. The harbor did not disappear. It paused. Pausing preserved it. In Alexandria, this pause was especially visible. The city's identity depended on movement, yet night insisted on stillness without threatening that identity. Ships waited without anxiety. The sea had waited longer. The city trusted that morning would arrive and that water would cooperate again. In Rome, the river's patience offered a similar reassurance. Empires rose and fell on its banks, but at night the water treated them all the same. It listened to the present without comment on the past. In Baghdad, canals demonstrated balance. They accepted flow without demanding speed. At night, they taught the city how to slow without stagnating. Listening water also influenced architecture. Harbors were framed to reduce echo. Surfaces were chosen for durability rather than resonance. Lamps were placed to avoid glare on water that would invite unnecessary activity. The city designed around listening. This design reduced conflict. Many disputes arise from misunderstanding. Water clarified signals. A single sound could be traced. Silence meant stability.
The harbor simplified interpretation. There's a tendency to romanticize the harbor at night as peaceful. Peaceful is incomplete. The harbor was attentive. Attention is not relaxation. It is readiness without urgency. The harbor held that state reliably. This reliability allowed people to sleep near water. They trusted the harbor to announce danger. That trust was built on repetition. Night after night, listening water performed its role. The city benefited indirectly. When people slept well, the day functioned better. The harbor contributed to this by managing sound and temperature. It did infrastructure work without recognition. The humor returns when considering how governance failed to replicate this effect. Laws tried to regulate noise and movement. Water did it more effectively by being there. No enforcement needed. No penalties posted. Consequence traveled naturally. Listening water also softened borders. The edge between city and sea blurred acoustically. Sound crossed it easily, movement did not. This asymmetry mattered. Information traveled without commerce, awareness without intrusion. As the night deepened, the harbor reached its quiet peak. Not silence, but low-frequency consistency. The city could hear itself breathing through water. This sound was not comforting in a sentimental way. It was familiar. Familiarity reduces anxiety. Those awake late learned to read the harbor as a clock. Changes in sound marked phases of night. The last adjustments, the final settling, the steady middle. Approaching dawn brought subtle shifts. Water announced time without counting it. This announcement mattered because it was non-disruptive. It did not demand attention. It allowed attention to drift. People could listen without listening. The harbor did not insist. Over generations, this relationship shaped urban patience. Cities learned that not everything required response. Some things required listening. Water modeled that restraint nightly. When morning approached, the harbor did not change character abruptly. It accepted increased sound gradually. The first oar, the first footstep, the first voice. Water adjusted without complaint because it had rested. This rest was not inactivity. It was regulated motion. Tides moved, currents shifted, but nothing hurried. The harbor preserved itself by maintaining rhythm. Across Alexandria, Rome, Baghdad, and countless other places, where water touched city, the same pattern held. Night reduced human noise. Water listened. Listening taught restraint. Restraint preserved function. In this way, the harbor at night belonged to everyone without belonging to anyone. It accepted sound impartially and returned only what needed to be heard. It did not judge importance. It amplified carelessness and rewarded calm. History rarely credits water for urban survival. It credits builders, rulers, traders. Night suggests another contributor. The harbor listened while the city slept. And because it listened, the city could afford to be quiet. Power did not disappear at night. That would have been dramatic, and night rarely encouraged drama. Instead, authority learned to lower its voice. It remained present, intact, and aware, but it stopped announcing itself. In the year 900, this was not a failure of control. It was an adaptation. During the day, authority depended on visibility. It relied on being seen, heard, recognized, and occasionally feared. Commands traveled through noise. Status was reinforced by presence. Power behaved like something that needed witnesses in order to function. Night removed most of those witnesses. Rather than collapse under this condition, Authority adjusted. In Rome, this adjustment was long overdue. The city carried centuries of institutional memory about command, ritual, and public display. Even after much of that structure weakened, the habit of asserting importance lingered. At night, however, assertion felt unnecessary and inefficient. Guards remained, officials existed, but they did not perform. They monitored quietly, stepping aside rather than forward. This withdrawal was strategic. A loud authority in a quiet city would have stood out in ways that invited resistance or ridicule. Silence protected legitimacy. By learning to whisper, power blended into the environment rather than competing with it. The city did not feel controlled. It felt watched, just enough to remain stable. In Baghdad, this whispering came more naturally. The city understood systems and timing. Authority here did not rely on constant reinforcement. It trusted routines to carry order forward. At night, that trust became visible. Officials did not interfere unless necessary. Administration slept because it could. That confidence was a form of strength. Whispering authority changed the relationship between rulers and ruled, if only temporarily. Orders were replaced by expectations. Presence replaced proclamation. People behaved not because they were reminded to, but because they understood the rhythm of night. Authority allowed this understanding to operate without interruption. In Alexandria, authority learned a different lesson. The city was shaped by movement and exchange, which made control difficult even during the day. At night, authority focused on edges rather than centers. Harbors, gates, and crossings received attention. Interiors were left alone. Power did not try to manage everything. It chose where to be audible and where to remain silent. This selectivity mattered. It reduced friction. People knew where authority might appear and where it would not. Predictability replaced omnipresence. Night rewarded this restraint by remaining calm. The humor in all of this is understated. Institutions that spent daylight issuing instructions discovered that most people did not need them at night. Sleep solved compliance more effectively than surveillance. A resting population required less management. Authority also learned that its tools changed after sunset. Law, which depended on clarity and record, became cumbersome. Force, which depended on momentum, became conspicuous. What remained useful was discretion, a quiet word, a steady presence, the ability to observe without intervening. This shift did not weaken authority, it preserved it. Power that insists on being loud when the environment is quiet risks sounding insecure. Night exposed that risk. The cities that endured were those whose authority knew when to step back. In Rome, this stepping back was especially visible around former centers of power. Forums once crowded stood empty. Authority did not attempt to animate them artificially. It allowed them to rest. This restraint acknowledged reality rather than denying it. The city benefited from honesty. In Baghdad, whispering authority manifested as trust in infrastructure. Systems designed to function without constant supervision did exactly that. Water flowed, lamps guided, streets rested. Authority watched, satisfied that the design held. In Alexandria, authority learned to coexist with uncertainty. The sea could not be commanded. Trade could not be scheduled precisely. At night, authority aligned itself with natural rhythms rather than opposing them. This alignment reduced conflict and preserved order. Whispering also altered the emotional texture of power.
Fear diminished. Respect shifted from spectacle to reliability. People did not feel oppressed by authority at night. They felt supported by its absence. This absence was not neglect. It was care. Those tasked with enforcing order understood this intuitively. Guards adjusted posture, patrols shortened routes. Intervention thresholds rose. A minor disturbance was allowed to resolve itself. Authority conserved energy by not responding to everything. This conservation mattered. Cities that exhausted authority during the day relied on night to restore it. Whispering was not laziness, it was maintenance. Night also revealed how much authority depended on consent. When noise fell, only cooperative behavior remained visible. Most people complied with expectations without prompting. Authority observed this quietly, learning that control was often less active than assumed. The irony deepens when considering that authority often justified itself through necessity. Night demonstrated that necessity was contextual. What was necessary at noon was intrusive at midnight. Power that failed to recognize this difference appeared clumsy. Power that adapted appeared wise. Over time, this nightly lesson shaped governance. Cities began to differentiate between times of command and times of allowance. Curfews, where they existed, were often lighter than expected. Enforcement relied on habit rather than punishment. Authority learned to trust the city to carry itself through the night. This trust was not naive. It was informed by repetition. Night after night, the same patterns held. Most people slept. Those awake behaved cautiously. Disturbances were rare and noticeable. Authority intervened only when needed. The system worked. Whispering authority also respected privacy. Loud power intrudes, quiet power observes. At night, observation was sufficient. People did not feel watched constantly, they felt unbothered. This reduced resentment and increased compliance the next day. In Rome, where history had trained people to associate authority with spectacle, this was a significant shift. Power no longer demanded attention. It accepted invisibility as a form of legitimacy. In Baghdad, the shift reinforced existing strengths. Administrative confidence grew from knowing when not to act. Authority that slept well governed better in the morning. In Alexandria, whispering authority maintained fragile balances. It prevented escalation. It allowed the city's complexity to settle rather than collide. The shared result was a city that felt lighter at night, not freer in a political sense, but less burdened. People moved with ease because they were not negotiating power constantly. Authority made room for rest. This rest mattered. Exhausted cities make poor decisions. Night preserved judgment by pausing it. Authority benefited from this pause even if it did not advertise the fact. As dawn approached, authority prepared to raise its voice again. But it did so gradually. Orders returned with light. Presence increased with activity. The transition was smooth because whispering had preserved continuity. Power that can whisper can also speak clearly when required. Night trained authority in modulation. It learned that volume was not strength. Appropriateness was. Across Rome, Baghdad, and Alexandria, this lesson repeated without coordination. Authority survived not by insisting on control at all hours, but by choosing when to step back. History rarely records this. It prefers moments when power shouts or collapses. Night shows another path. Authority that learns to whisper does not weaken. It endures. And so,
In the quiet hours of 900, power lowered its voice, watched carefully, and allowed the city to rest. Morning would give it plenty to say. Sleep did not belong to culture. It did not require explanation, permission, or shared belief. In the year 900, sleep arrived everywhere, not as a ritual, but as a habit so widespread that it barely qualified as a choice. It was the one behavior cities never argued about, because arguing required wakefulness, and wakefulness eventually lost. What made sleep powerful was not depth or comfort. It was regularity. Night after night, across climates and languages, bodies followed the same arc. Activity narrowed, attention loosened, muscles surrendered. Consciousness withdrew without ceremony. This repetition mattered more than intention. Sleep functioned as infrastructure precisely because it did not depend on motivation. In Rome, sleep arrived as a practical necessity rather than a luxury. The city had long learned that exhaustion was costly. Stone streets, administrative memory, and dense living required bodies that could function again tomorrow. Sleep did not promise renewal in a philosophical sense. It promised that people could stand up again. That was sufficient. In Baghdad, sleep supported complexity. A city that depended on coordination understood the price of fatigue. Systems that worked smoothly by day required minds that could disengage by night. Sleep here was not withdrawal from responsibility. It was preparation for it. The city trusted this preparation enough to stop monitoring it closely. In Alexandria, sleep negotiated with movement. Trade connected distant places, but bodies remained local. Sleep anchored people to immediate space, even as the city looked outward. The sea might not rest, but the people did. That division preserved balance. Sleep's global quality lay in its indifference to status. Wealth altered bedding, not need. Authority altered schedule, not biology. Even those who attempted to resist sleep eventually failed quietly. Night waited patiently. Sleep did not pursue, it outlasted. This outlasting mattered. Cities depended on continuity more than intensity. A single night of sleep prevented a chain of errors. 10 nights preserved judgment. Hundreds sustained institutions without requiring heroism. Sleep achieved stability without drawing attention. There was mild irony in how this worked. Societies praised vigilance and productivity, yet survived on unconsciousness. Sleep did not build monuments. It prevented collapse. Because it left no visible trace, it received little credit. Cities rarely celebrated their ability to sleep well. They only noticed when they could not. Sleep also simplified behavior. Once people lay down, choices ended. Conflicts paused. Planning dissolved. The mind accepted limits without negotiation. This simplification reduced strain not only on individuals but on the city as a whole. A sleeping population was predictable. Predictability reduced risk. The predictability extended beyond people. Animals adjusted. Tools rested. Fires were banked. Water systems flowed steadily without intervention. Sleep synchronized the city's components by slowing them together. This synchronization was accidental yet reliable. Importantly, sleep did not require uniformity. People slept at different depths, in different positions, at slightly different times. What mattered was overlap. Enough people slept at once to quiet the city.
Enough quiet allowed deeper sleep. The cycle reinforced itself. Sleep also erased difference temporarily. Dreams did not respect citizenship. They borrowed freely. A farmer dreamed of water. A merchant dreamed of roads. A guard dreamed of nothing in particular. These dreams did not reshape policy. They reshaped patience. Waking up felt manageable because sleep had diluted urgency. The humor here was understated. Cities that struggled to align interests during the day achieved near total alignment at night by doing nothing. No coordination required, no ideology needed. Sleep succeeded where planning often failed. Sleep also softened memory. Events of the day lost sharp edges. Anger cooled, anxiety dulled. Even grief paused briefly. Sleep did not resolve these states. It reduced their intensity enough to prevent accumulation. This reduction preserved social function. In Rome, this meant that lingering resentment did not dominate every morning. In Baghdad, it meant that administrative disputes did not compound endlessly. In Alexandria, it meant that uncertainty did not erode confidence entirely. Sleep provided emotional maintenance without addressing cause. The global habit of sleep also structured time. Night was not just absence of day, it was a period with its own expectations. People planned around sleep even when they did not articulate it. Work ended because sleep approached. Travel paused because sleep would interrupt it anyway. Night asserted itself through inevitability. Sleep's inevitability was its authority. Unlike law or command, it did not need enforcement. Resistance only delayed it briefly. Eventually the body complied. Cities adapted by accommodating this compliance rather than opposing it. Architecture reflected this adaptation. Rooms were shaped for rest. Noise was managed. Light was controlled. These designs were not uniform across cultures, but their purpose was. They existed to make sleep possible without effort. This effortlessness mattered. Sleep that required planning would fail frequently. Sleep that arrived naturally succeeded. Cities that survived learned to remove obstacles rather than impose schedules. They allowed sleep to happen rather than trying to optimize it. Sleep also marked equality in a subtle way. While inequality shaped waking life, sleep redistributed vulnerability. Everyone lay still. Everyone trusted walls and habit. Everyone depended on the same darkness. For a few hours, the city did not rank consciousness. This lack of ranking was not celebrated. It was unnoticed. And because it was unnoticed, it endured. Sleep did not threaten hierarchy. It ignored it. Ignoring hierarchy proved safer than challenging it. As night deepened, sleep reached its widest spread. The city grew uniformly quiet. Only necessary motion remained. The shared condition became complete enough to feel natural. No one thought of it as collective behavior. It simply was. Morning did not break this habit, it relied on it. Waking assumed that sleeping had occurred. Cities expected people to rise rested enough to function. When that expectation failed, the consequences were immediate. Errors increased. Tempers shortened. Systems strained. Sleep's absence revealed its importance. Over centuries, this lesson embedded itself deeply. Cities did not write it down. They did not teach it formally. They structured life around it anyway. Night existed to allow sleep. Sleep existed to allow continuation. The global nature of this habit also connected places indirectly. While Rome slept, Baghdad slept.
While Alexandria slept, countless unnamed towns slept. These places did not synchronize deliberately. They synchronized biologically. That synchronization made the world feel coherent, even when politics did not. Sleep also limited ambition. No project could continue indefinitely. No campaign could ignore night forever. Sleep imposed pauses that no authority could override completely. This limitation prevented total exhaustion of resources and people alike. There is a quiet dignity in this. Sleep did not negotiate with power. It outlasted it. Empires changed. Sleep did not. Cities rose and fell. Sleep remained. By 900, this pattern was ancient. It did not feel historical. It felt obvious. People did not think of sleep as something shared globally. They thought of it as something that happened because it always had. And that was its strength. As dawn approached, sleep loosened gradually. People stirred. Consciousness returned unevenly. The city reassembled piece by piece. But it did so on a foundation that sleep had preserved. The night had done its work without witnesses. This is where the story settles. Not on conquest or decline, but on habit. Sleep, quiet and unremarkable, held cities together when nothing else could. It required no loyalty. It asked for no belief. It arrived nightly and left behind just enough strength to continue. In Rome, Baghdad, Alexandria, and across the world that never coordinated itself otherwise, sleep functioned as the most reliable agreement humanity ever made. Not written, not enforced, repeated until it became invisible. And because it was invisible, it endured.